Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is Douglas Kennett, an Associate Professor in the Department of Anthropology. Douglas Kennett earned his BA, MA, and PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He came to the University of Oregon in 2001. His research interests include evolutionary theory, the study of human impact on ancient environments, the study of human transition to agriculture, coastal and island archaeology, and the emergence of social hierarchies. He's the author of numerous peer-reviewed professional papers. He's the co-editor or author of 3 books, including Behavioral Ecology and the Transition to Agriculture, published in July of 2006, and The Island Chumash, Behavioral Ecology of a Maritime Society, 2005. His most recent research at the remote island of Rapu in the South Pacific is providing new ideas about the settlement of the area. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Anthropology, how did you in anthropology become acquainted? You're a guy who grew up in, well, at least you lived a part of your life in Rhode Island. When did you get turned on to your subject?
Really as an undergraduate at the University of Rhode Island. Yeah, so I think this is a good, shows the value of a general education kind of education. And so went in as a business major and started taking some general education courses, and then became interested in anthropology and archaeology specifically.
And so you majored in anthropology, and then you went out west.
Yeah, at the University of Rhode Island for 2 years, I started becoming interested in anthropology and archaeology, and basically decided that I wanted to try and make a career in that, or at least get my undergraduate degree in anthropology, and then had the opportunity to move out to the University of California, Santa Barbara, where they had a larger anthropology department, and there were some exciting things happening there. So I shifted when I was an undergraduate and finally finished my undergraduate degree there.
So coming from the East Coast to the West Coast, did that change in climate and the natural environment, do you think that had any influence on your feeling about the environment and the land and anthropology and that sort of thing?
To a certain degree, I think. I think I've always been interested. I mean, I grew up in coastal Rhode Island, so that wasn't too much of a shift. I feel very comfortable in sort of coastal environments and being outside. And I think that's one of the things that drew me to archaeology, because there's a substantial amount of field work that's involved, and you have to like camping and being outside, and you know, working with other people and to gather data about the human past.
And you were fortunate that at Santa Barbara that you were able to find people that you could do graduate work with at the same institution. Yeah,
right. When I shifted to the University of California at Santa Barbara, I was interested in both cultural anthropology, so working with living humans, and started to become more and more interested in archaeology, but ended up getting my degree in cultural anthropology. And then decided that there were several people there that were doing the kinds of projects that I was interested in, and they were interested in working with me, so I ended up staying at Santa Barbara and getting my master's degree and PhD at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Well,
we're glad you've come north now. Tell us about last summer, or you're on the island Rapu.
Of Rapa.
Oh, sorry, yeah. Rapa.
Rapa, that's fine. Well, the island of Rapa is an amazing place. It's a very remote island in French Polynesia. What drew me to this island is that its remoteness, really, and sort of the possibilities of being able to look at sort of the colonization history and sort of the evolutionary history of cultures on that island in a fairly controlled setting. So islands in the Pacific can sort of be sort of a natural laboratory for looking at cultural evolutionary processes.
How did you find Rapa?
It's an interesting story. I was actually working in another island group in the Pacific, in the Fijian archipelago, with a colleague of mine named Ethel Anderson from the Australian National University. in Canberra. And I just actually finished up my PhD work and at Santa Barbara, and I was working actually in Western North America on the Channel Islands, which resulted in the book The Island Chumash. And I was very interested in sort of evolutionary processes and the economic intensification, why certain individuals would start intensifying various aspects of their economy, and sort of mixed in with that, you often see the emergence of social hierarchies. So I was interested in the process of how that comes together, because it happens on the Channel Islands, it happens in the Pacific, it's a worldwide kind of evolutionary phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
So I was sort of interested in the mechanisms and the processes involved in these kinds of developments worldwide. And again, Rapa produced a context where I could kind of study some of these processes. And one of the things I was really interested in was the role of warfare and competition between individuals and groups as a contextual variable for thinking about why people settle down and become territorial, and perhaps in this context, this is one of the mechanisms for the emergence of social hierarchies, one of the important contextual variables.
You mean the fact of war itself?
The fact of war itself basically circumscribing.
Forces people to...
Well, basically, people are making decisions about whether or not they're staying in groups or going to leave groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the fundamental paradoxes in human history is why do we have hierarchies? Why would people kind of give up their rights and be subjugated basically by other individuals in a group? So I think it's an interesting evolutionary question, and I think that warfare perhaps plays a role. I mean, there are lots of other variables that are related to demography and environment.
Right. Then we have to ask, why do people have wars?
Yeah, right. And that's a very dynamic process that I'm interested in. And again, Rapa is interesting because it was colonized relatively late.
Mm-hmm.
I should tell you a little bit about the island.
Please.
It's basically it's a small volcanic island. It's basically the top of a volcanic caldera that's been breached. So it has a large internal bay, but it basically is a U-shaped island or C-shaped island. It's about 1,000 kilometers south of the island of Tahiti in French Polynesia, and it's 530 kilometers away from another inhabitable island. So that's about the distance between Eugene and Seattle. Just to kind of give you an idea of how...
Pretty isolated.
So it's a pretty isolated place. Just to give you an idea of what it took to go there are only 6 boats a year that go to Rapa. And we were lucky enough to catch one of those, but once we caught it, it was a 56-hour boat ride with modern technology and a modern ship. And then we were there for 2 months with... there's no airstrip. There's no really way of getting off the island. So even today, it's very remote.
And how many is there a population? Are there humans that live on Rapa today? How many?
Today, well, that's we've been really interested in patterns of demography through time on the island. And today, there's a population of about 480 people on the island, but that includes school children who actually. High school students and university students that leave the island for part of the year. So, maybe 380, 370 people would be on the island.
Yeah.
And there are 2 small communities that are today down on this internal bay, which is it's a natural harbor. There are lots of resources there. It makes a lot of sense that, a population of that size would be living close to these, close to agricultural lands. What's interesting is that one of the major research questions that we had when we went to the island, because the last archaeologist to be on the island was an archaeologist named Thor Heyerdahl in the 1950s, very famous archaeologist, and no one had been back since, and we know why now, because it's so remote and difficult to get to. And he went there, and what drew him there were these large fortifications. So this is where sort of the role of warfare comes in, and there are 10 large fortifications on the island, and he documented them, but there was really no information about what the age of them.
Did you find that out when they were built?
Yeah, we did. That was one of the major objectives. There are 2 objectives that we had for the research. One was to find out when the island was colonized, and we had a fairly good idea based on patterns elsewhere in the Pacific. So we thought that maybe 1,000 years ago, 800 years ago. And the work that we did on the island over that 2-month period and the subsequent laboratory analysis suggests that the earliest sites on the island are about 800 years old.
Mm-hmm.
So around AD 1200 is when people arrived on the island based on the current data. Then we also did a substantial amount of work at the fortifications themselves. We visited all the major fortifications. Just kind of give you an idea of what these things look like.
Sure.
Again, they're on the crest of this volcanic caldera, looking down into what used to be the volcano itself, and now is an internal bay. And they were positioned right on the highest peaks all the way around the island, kind of evenly dispersed around the top of this caldera. And you can see them across the island. Each of the mountaintops was actually carved into a tower, and then faced off with stone, stone walls, flattened off. And then below each one there are a series of domestic terraces where people were living. And in fact, there's some ethnographic evidence to suggest that the highest status individual in each community actually lived on the very top of that mountain on that flattened platform. And then surrounding these are our defensive ditches and other kinds of storage features and things like that, house hearths and walls, and there's a substantial amount of architecture. They're not living there today. The population is now down on down next to the coast and on the bay itself.
So who was fighting whom, and how many people were there around then in those days? Yeah,
we're trying to model the demography. We have a little bit of historic information about the island. An explorer named Vancouver passed through in 1791 and actually didn't make landfall on the island because about 300 individuals in canoes came out to greet him, and he kind of sensed that they were a threat. He felt threatened basically, so he left the island. But based on his observations, he estimated that there were about 2,000 people living on the island. So you can imagine that in the early colonization stages, maybe a few canoe loads, fairly large canoes, around AD 1200, and then by AD 1791, there were about 2,000 people living on the island in what I call a kind of a hyper-fortified state. And who are they competing against? They're competing against each other. This is what's interesting about Rapa. It's so far away that there's no indication that once people arrived on the island that there was much interaction with other island groups.
I see. So it was an internal.
So it's an internal
conflict.
Yes. Yeah. So again, for studying the processes involved in the emergence of social hierarchies and the role of warfare, and also associated with this are two other things: economic intensification, and in this particular case, it's agriculture. So you can actually see these fortifications, by the way, in satellite imagery that we had specially taken for the project. You could also see in each of the valley bottoms, with agricultural land is amazingly limited on this island. It's a very dramatic landscape with very just small areas where you can actually practice agriculture. And in those areas you can see agricultural terraces that some of them are still used today, maybe 10%. But you can see the remnants of those agricultural terraces that were used prehistorically. So we know that they were using intensive agriculture to sustain this population that grew internally on the island.
Well, did you get a sense then, if you have one group of fortifications, I mean, where was the other? I mean, there must have been, if they were fighting with each other, was there a counterpart to this one area around the volcano, or is?
Well, there are 10 independent fortifications around the rim of the volcano.
I see, and you have a feeling that those were somehow in competition with each other.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just two groups; it was
No.
10. So maybe if you have a population of a couple of thousand, then you've only got, what is it? You do the math, and not very many for each.
Yeah. We have a little bit of information again from the ethno-historic record about the population size. So the largest communities would have been 300 to 400 people, and then some of the smaller communities maybe 100 to 200 people. And sort of to answer your question about the evolutionary history of fortification on the island, we excavated at the 10 major fortifications and took samples for radiocarbon dating so we could establish the age of those fortifications. And we have a sequence basically spanning a couple of hundred years. So we have colonization at AD 1200. And then the first fortifications, and there are two, which is what you'd expect because they would be competing against one another.
Right.
One on each side of the caldera at around AD 1400, so about 200 years later. And then just before historic contact in 1791, there are at least, we think 8, maybe 8 to 10 fortifications that are occupied at about the same time. And that's fairly consistent with what Vancouver documented. He thought that he saw at least 6 fortifications that were occupied, and he described these things. He talked about. Now today, in the archaeological record, we just see stone walls and terraced platforms. He described wooden blockhouses that were on top of these terraces, and surrounding these fortifications, we do see defensive ditches. But he also described wooden palisades, so wooden walls, a series of them going down the mountainside. So there were a number of defensive features that were associated with these, each of these fortifications, and that this indicates that they were concerned about defense.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, then the oldest ones, there are a couple that are oldest. You were saying?
Yeah, right around AD 1400.
So it looks like already there was conflict, and then it seems like the groups multiplied that were in conflict with each other.
Exactly. Yeah. And actually, you can imagine sort of that within these communities, and that's interesting. Sort of the dynamics of social interaction within communities and then between communities. That's going to really shape sort of the decisions that individuals make to either stay in a group or to leave a group. So you can imagine that under certain instances, when you have two competing polities, let's call them, you have two competing communities, there may be instances where there would be fissioning of a community to occupy another area. So basically, it looks like they're staking out parts of the island, and agricultural land is really the key.
Well, I was going to say that. Do you think the reason why there was so much conflict was because there was so little land to actually
that's basically it. So it really shows you sort of what demographic pressure does and what the social and political ramifications of that. There are also some other interesting things that we've documented with another component of the project was to reconstruct the environment through this same interval of time to see what the impact of colonization was and then what the impact associated with intensified agricultural practices on the island was. Which also relates into the sort of dynamic interaction. So if you have people impacting the environment in some negative way, that's going to sort of reduce overall productivity. And then even this very limited land even becomes, the overall productivity of it is reduced. And we do see there's some major changes that occur on the island in these environmental records. And basically we're getting these from wetland areas down near the coast. And there's a graduate student from Australia National University who is not an archaeologist but an environmental scientist who took sediment cores at multiple locations around the island and is just finishing his PhD right now, reconstructing changes in the environment over, say, the last 2,000 years. And we see pretty major shifts at around AD 1200 when people arrived. We see the introduction of new plants, in particular domesticates, that were grown in these agricultural systems because they're not native plants to the island. They were carried by ancestral Polynesians out to East Polynesia. There are a variety of them, but the primary one on Rapa is a plant called taro. If you get there are these chips at Trader Joe's actually that have different kinds of tubers, and they have the purple ones. That's taro. That's an important crop in the Pacific. It's grown in lots of places, including Easter Island and Hawaii, in these pond field agricultural systems, which kind of resemble rice paddies to a certain degree. So it's a kind of a wet a wet system crop. And the agricultural lands there are actually really well suited to growing this. So the people clearly carried that with them to Rapa in their canoes, and then started immediately growing this plant and practicing agriculture in what we imagine to be a sort of a small sector of the island near the initial colonization sites. So
I wanted to ask you about the contact period, because you say was it the late 18th century when the contact was,
yeah,
I guess,
so
with Europeans?
So 1790, so that's the first contact, and then there isn't much. There's a
That's,
period
you're talking
when
about Vancouver. Is this
that's Vancouver? Yeah, right.
So
Then there was a missionary, a Protestant missionary was established on the island in the early 1800s. So there was missionaries were visiting the island, and there's some records associated with that, talking about the populations at that time. So we know that there was a missionary named Davies who was there probably for the first time in around 1810, and then again in 1815. And he talked about the population of the island at that time being about 1,500 people, but he said it had been significantly reduced from the last time he had been on the island, but we don't know exactly what.
We don't know why.
Well, we don't know why, but we don't know what significant is, because there's some questions about the 2,000, Vancouver's estimate of 2,000 people. It could be slightly higher than that, and some people have argued that that is the case.
Well, you were mentioning Vancouver's felt threatened when he first came to the island, and I was wondering, with doing comparative archaeology, were these people, because perhaps of the lack of arable land, were they more aggressive, more hostile to outsiders than other people in the area? I mean, I was just wondering what you're finding out about the contact.
It may have been more of a perceived threat.
I see.
There's a lot of information, ethnohistoric information, ethnographic information about interactions, both positive and negative, throughout the Pacific. And this is actually a Polynesian pattern. It's not just specific to Rapa, that you have people living in fairly large communities that are competing with one another, sometimes violently, but they're also cooperating with each other too. And that they're living in hierarchical kinds of situations where you have stratified societies with people that are chiefs and people that are in these same communities that are don't have the same kinds of luxuries, economic, political, or social as these chiefs. So that's a Polynesian pattern, and I think some of the similar processes are occurring on other islands. And again, the entire Pacific, each of these islands provides a slightly different context for studying these evolutionary processes. So that's what I'm really excited about, is looking at these sorts of things. I think Rapa is an excellent example.
So in the 4 minutes or so that we have left, I wonder if you could tell us, before we went on camera, you were mentioning a grant that you're writing. You want to tell us about this next project you're involved in?
Sure. This project is related in the sense that I'm interested in, actually it's a large team of people that are interested in looking at the dynamic interactions between humans and the environment that they live in. And that's environment I would define as sort of the natural environment, but also the social and political elements of the environment, the interactions that are going on but between people, and how that changes with dynamically changing social and natural environments that humans are also contributing to, because they're having an impact on the landscape that they're occupying. And this is a project that's actually not in the Pacific, but it's in the Maya region in southern Belize, and I'm pulling together a large interdisciplinary team. So it's kind of similar to the Rapa work, trying to get at the environment, trying to get at the human history from a variety of different perspectives. But now looking at more on a continental scale, so much more complicated, many more interactions, not isolated, but a fascinating question that has similar sorts of, evolutionary threads, similar to the Rapan research. So we're interested in sort of the colonization of these habitats down in southern Belize by initial colonists, and then the expansion of populations. There we actually have a transition to agriculture, so there were foraging populations that adopted different domesticates, in this case maize or corn, and other very important Mesoamerican domesticates as well. And then some transformations in the way people were living, and that the transformations in how they're living, in terms of groups and group size, and then ultimately leading to the similar kinds of developments, large communities occupying the landscape, competing against one another, and the development of social hierarchies, and in this case developing into states, or very small states that we know about. And then we're also interested in the collapse of these states in this particular case, because that's I think something that archaeologists can really contribute to is one thing that we know about political systems and states from the archaeological record is they develop and then they collapse. And we live in a state-level society, so we should be concerned about the processes involved in state development and collapse. And that's one of the central issues that we're trying to get at, and all the complex dynamics between humans and their environment.
But Belize is a place that people have heard about, I think, as opposed to
Rapa, yeah.
As opposed to Rapa. So one would think that the work has been done in Belize.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's one of the positive things and one of the negative things. There has been a substantial amount of work that's been done in the Maya area, and not specifically in southern Belize. I mean, there's been work done in southern Belize, but so we can really tap into and have much more information about surrounding areas in terms of how they were organized politically, socially, people at various times going back. Now, this is a much longer history that we're dealing with. We're just dealing with the last 4,000 years in this particular project, and you could extend it back to 12,000 years if you wanted to. So
yeah. Well, I wish you luck. I know that it takes a lot of funds and people power to do this, involving a lot of different folks from all over. So I wish you lots of luck with that project.
Thanks so much.
And it's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thanks for having me.
And we've been speaking with Douglas Kennett, an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Oregon. Thank you for watching.